It was a regular Monday morning, or at least it seemed that way at first. The office buzzed with the hum of conversations, clacking keyboards, and the occasional ring of a phone. For James Carter, a dedicated employee in his late 20s, this was just another day to prove his worth. James was known around the office for his unwavering dedication, sharp problem-solving skills, and a warm demeanor that earned him the respect of many colleagues. However, not everyone shared that respect. Enter Martin Graves, the regional manager. Martin had a reputation that preceded him, strict, authoritative, and, as many whispered behind closed doors, harboring an undercurrent of prejudice. His arrival at the office was usually accompanied by tension, and this morning was no different. Employees scrambled to look busy as he strode through the halls, his polished shoes clicking against the floor like a metronome, marking the time until the next confrontation. The morning unfolded uneventfully until the meeting was called. It was an impromptu gathering, which in Martin's world meant someone was about to be scrutinized. James sat in his chair, his back straight and his mind alert, while others around the table exchanged uneasy glances. Martin stood at the head of the room, his gaze scanning the group as though weighing their worth. As the meeting progressed, Martin's critiques became increasingly harsh, veering into personal territory. He targeted different employees, picking apart their work with a cold precision that left some visibly uncomfortable. But when his attention turned to James, the atmosphere in the room shifted entirely. "James," Martin began, his voice dripping with condescension. "It seems you've been struggling to keep up with the standards we expect here. Perhaps I've been too lenient with you." His words were sharp, but James maintained his composure, meeting Martin's gaze with calm resolve. Then came the moment that would alter the course of the day, and perhaps James' career, forever. Martin leaned forward, his voice lowering but loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "I wonder if your kind knows what hard work really means. Maybe you're better suited for simpler tasks. After all, some habits die hard. Isn't that right, James?" The room fell silent. Everyone froze, eyes darting between Martin and James, their expressions a mix of shock and horror. The weight of the words hung in the air like a storm cloud, oppressive and inescapable. James could feel the heat rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay composed. Years of enduring subtle and overt prejudice had taught him to choose his battles wisely. Martin, emboldened by James's silence, chuckled darkly and added, "Maybe I should call you a slave, since you seem to have forgotten your place." Gasps erupted around the table. Even those who typically stayed silent couldn't hide their reactions to the blatant insult. James's heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained stoic. Inside, however, a storm brewed, a mix of hurt, anger, and determination. For a moment, James said nothing, letting the weight of Martin's words settle over the room. The silence became deafening, the tension unbearable. Then, with deliberate slowness, he pushed his chair back and stood. Every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on him, waiting to see how he would respond. James's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, but carried an undeniable strength. "Mr. Graves," he began, his tone measured, "I believe you've just crossed a line that no professional or human being, for that matter, should ever cross. But instead of stooping to your level, I think it's time for everyone here to learn what true strength and dignity look like." The office remained breathlessly silent, the anticipation thick in the air. James' next words would set the stage for what was to come, a response that no one, least of all Martin, could have predicted. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. James stood tall, his eyes locked with Martin's in a way that made the older man visibly uncomfortable for the first time. While James' tone remained calm, there was a fire behind his words that demanded attention. He scanned the room, noting the uneasy faces of his colleagues, some filled with fear, others with quiet admiration. "Before I say anything more," James continued, his voice steady but commanding, "let me make one thing clear. Respect is earned, not demanded, and it's something I've worked hard to give to everyone in this room, including you, Mr. Graves." The weight of his words seemed to hang in the air, and Martin shifted uncomfortably, his usual confidence starting to falter. James took a deep breath, steadying himself as memories of his own journey began to surface. He hadn't always been this composed, this grounded. It had taken years of enduring prejudice and proving himself over and over again to get to where he was now. James had grown up in a modest neighborhood, raised by parents who had taught him the value of hard work and integrity. His father, a mechanic who worked long hours to provide for the family, often said, "Son, people will try to define you before they even know you. It's your job to show them who you really are." Those words echoed in James' mind now, giving him the strength to face the situation with dignity. He looked around the room, his gaze landing briefly on his colleagues, some of whom had worked alongside him for years. He could see the unease in their eyes, but also the silent encouragement. It was clear that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every person in the room who had ever felt belittled, undermined, or disrespected. "Mr. Graves," James said, his voice softening but losing none of its power, "you may think your words can diminish me, but they don't. In fact, they say a lot more about you than they ever could about me." Martin's face flushed, his bravado cracking under the weight of James' calm confidence. But James wasn't done. He turned his attention to the rest of the room, addressing his colleagues as if inviting them into the conversation. "I've worked here for 5 years," James said, his voice steady and sincere. "In that time, I've poured my heart into every project, stayed late when deadlines loomed, and supported every one of you when you needed help. I've done that because I believe in teamwork, in lifting each other up. But moments like this remind me that not everyone sees things the same way." He paused, letting the words sink in. The room was still tense, but there was a shift, a growing sense of solidarity among the employees. James could feel it, and it gave him the courage to continue. "What's most disappointing," James added, his eyes returning to Martin, "is that someone in your position, a leader, should know better. Leadership isn't about tearing people down or using power to belittle others. It's about inspiring, guiding, and respecting the people you're responsible for." Martin opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, his jaw tightened, and he crossed his arms defensively. James, however, didn't need a response. This wasn't about engaging in a back and forth. It was about standing up for himself and, in doing so, setting an example for everyone watching. As James spoke, his mind flickered back to the first time he'd encountered workplace discrimination. It had been subtle, a dismissive comment here, a critical look there, but over time, the small slights had added up. He remembered confiding in his mother about it, feeling frustrated and powerless. She had listened patiently before offering him the advice that now guided him. "Don't let anyone steal your peace, James. Stand firm in who you are, and the rest will follow." That advice had carried him through countless challenges, and it was carrying him now. He didn't know exactly how the situation would unfold, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let Martin's words define him. As the silence stretched on, James noticed a shift in the room. A few colleagues nodded subtly in agreement with his words. Others exchanged glances, as though silently deciding where they stood. It was clear that this moment was bigger than just James and Martin. It was a turning point for the entire office. Martin, however, wasn't ready to back down entirely. Clearing his throat, he straightened his posture and attempted to regain control of the situation. "James," he said, his tone more measured but still laced with condescension, "perhaps you've misunderstood my intentions. I'm simply trying to ensure that everyone here is held to the same high standards." James raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "With all due respect, Mr. Graves, there's a difference between holding people to high standards and using demeaning language to assert authority. If you truly believe in professionalism, then perhaps you should start by demonstrating it yourself." The subtle murmur of agreement from the room was unmistakable. Martin glanced around, his confidence waning further as he realized the tide was turning against him. For years, he had ruled through intimidation, but now he was facing something he hadn't anticipated, a unified front. James could feel the momentum building, but he knew this was only the beginning. While he had made his point, there was still work to be done to ensure that this moment would lead to real change. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for a workplace where everyone, regardless of background, could feel valued and respected. Taking a deep breath, James looked directly at Martin and said, "This conversation isn't over. But for now, I think it's clear that we all need to take a moment to reflect on what kind of environment we want to create here. I hope you'll do the same, Mr. Graves." With that, James sat back down, his heart still pounding, but his resolve unshaken. The room remained silent, the tension palpable. No one quite knew what would happen next, but one thing was certain. James had taken a stand, and the ripple effects of his words were just beginning to spread. The meeting ended in a heavy silence. People shuffled out of the room, avoiding eye contact with Martin and whispering to one another as they went. James remained seated, his fingers lightly tapping the table as he replayed the exchange in his mind. He wasn't one to second-guess himself, but the weight of the moment hung on him like a heavy coat. What had just happened wasn't just a confrontation. It was a challenge to the status quo. Outside the meeting room, the atmosphere in the office was buzzing. Word of what had transpired spread quickly, and small groups formed near desks and in the break room, murmuring about James's bold response. Some were inspired by his courage, while others, those who had kept their heads down for years to avoid trouble, were unsure what it might mean for the office dynamic. James returned to his desk and logged into his computer, trying to focus on the report that had been due that morning. But the words on the screen blurred as his mind wandered. He felt the weight of the stares from his colleagues, a mixture of admiration and curiosity. A few people stopped by his desk, offering quiet words of support. "Hey James," said Mia, a colleague from marketing who had always been friendly to him. She leaned on the edge of his desk, her voice low. "What you did in there, I just want to say, that was brave. Not everyone would have stood up to him like that." James offered a small smile. "Thanks, Mia. It wasn't just about me, though. What he said, it was unacceptable, and I couldn't let it slide." She nodded, glancing around to make sure no one else was within earshot. "Well, just so you know, a lot of us are behind you. That kind of attitude has been going on for too long. Maybe now things will start to change." Her words were reassuring, but James knew that change wouldn't come easily. Martin had been in his position for years, and his power was rooted not only in his title but in the fear he cultivated. Challenging someone like that meant stepping into uncharted territory, and James wasn't naive about the risks. Later that afternoon, James received an email from HR requesting a meeting. His stomach tightened as he read the message. It was short and formal, asking him to come by the office at 3 p.m. He couldn't help but wonder if Martin had already started pushing back, using his influence to make James pay for speaking out. When the time came, James walked into the HR office with his shoulders squared and his head held high. The HR representative, a middle-aged woman named Linda, greeted him with a polite but reserved smile. She motioned for him to sit. "James, thank you for coming," she began, her tone professional but not unkind. "I wanted to touch base with you regarding the incident in the meeting earlier today." James nodded, his expression calm. "Of course, I'm happy to discuss it." Linda leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the desk. "First, let me say that we take situations like this very seriously. Several employees have already come forward to express their concerns about what was said. I'd like to hear your perspectives so we can document everything accurately." James recounted the events as objectively as he could, careful to focus on the facts while also conveying the impact of Martin's words. He explained how the comment about being a slave had crossed a line, not just professionally but personally, and why he had felt compelled to respond. When he finished, Linda nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you for sharing that, James. I understand how upsetting this must have been. I want to assure you that we are conducting a thorough investigation and will take appropriate action based on our findings." James appreciated her words, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the process might be slow and bureaucratic, leaving him exposed in the meantime. "I understand," he said carefully. "I just hope that whatever action is taken sends a clear message, not just to me but to everyone in the office, that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated." Linda gave him a small smile. "That's the goal. In the meantime, please don't hesitate to reach out if you need support." As James left the HR office, he couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and uncertainty. While it was reassuring to know the issue was being taken seriously, he also knew how easily things could be swept under the rug. Martin had connections, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. Back at his desk, James noticed an email notification pop up on his screen. It was from an unknown address with the subject line, "Thank you for speaking up." Curious, he opened it. The message was brief but heartfelt. "James, what you said today meant a lot to people like me who've been too scared to speak out. You stood up not just for yourself, but for all of us who felt overlooked or disrespected. Don't let anyone intimidate you. You're not alone in this." The email didn't include a name, but James could feel the sincerity behind the words. It was a reminder that his actions had resonated beyond the confines of the meeting room. Meanwhile, in his own office, Martin was stewing. The confrontation had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He prided himself on being in control, and James' refusal to back down had undermined that control in front of the entire team. He knew his reputation was at stake, and he was already considering ways to regain his footing. Martin called his assistant, a young man named Eric, into his office. "Eric," he barked, "I need a list of any performance issues James has had in the past 6 months. Missed deadlines, complaints. Anything that shows he's not as perfect as everyone seems to think." Eric hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I'll look into it, Mr. Graves," he said, his tone hesitant. But as he left the office, his mind raced. He had seen James work firsthand and knew it was unlikely he'd find anything substantial. Still, the request left him uneasy. As the day wore on, the tension in the office only grew. The divide between those who supported James and those who feared aligning themselves with him became more pronounced. And while James remained outwardly composed, he knew this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. The office atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. It wasn't just the lingering tension from the meeting. There was an undeniable shift in the way people interacted. Whispers in the break room became more frequent, and the usual hum of casual conversations now carried an undertone of unease. James could feel eyes on him whenever he walked by, a mix of admiration and curiosity. But there was something else, too: fear. Fear of what might happen next, fear of retaliation, fear of change. James stayed focused on his work, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. But deep down he was bracing himself for whatever Martin might do. He wasn't naive. He knew Martin wasn't the type to let something like this go quietly. Still, James felt a renewed sense of purpose, bolstered by the quiet affirmations he'd been receiving from his colleagues. Anonymous notes and whispered thank yous reminded him that his actions had struck a chord far beyond his own experience. On Wednesday, a new email from HR landed in James's inbox. It was an invitation to a follow-up meeting scheduled for Friday afternoon. The wording was vague but formal, and James couldn't tell whether it signaled progress or escalation. He stared at the screen for a moment before closing his laptop, deciding not to dwell on it just yet. There was no point in worrying about something he couldn't control. Meanwhile, Martin had been working behind the scenes, desperate to regain his footing. His attempts to dig up dirt on James had yielded nothing substantial, which only fueled his frustration. James' record was spotless, his work exemplary. Martin's usual tactics weren't working, and it left him feeling cornered. But Martin wasn't the only one plotting. Within the team, a quiet resistance was brewing. Mia and a few others had started meeting after hours, discussing how they could support James and push for broader changes in the office culture. They knew that this wasn't just about one incident. It was about dismantling a toxic environment that had persisted for too long. James can't fight this alone, Mia said one evening as they gathered at a nearby coffee shop. If we want real change, we all need to stand up with him. Otherwise, it's just words. The others nodded in agreement. There was a shared understanding that this moment was bigger than any one person. They began drafting a collective statement outlining their concerns and calling for accountability from leadership. It was a bold move, one that carried risks, but they felt it was necessary. Back at the office, James noticed that Martin had started avoiding direct interactions with him. Instead, Martin's orders came through intermediaries, and his usual domineering presence seemed to have receded slightly. But James wasn't fooled. He knew this was likely the calm before the storm. On Thursday, James received an unexpected visit at his desk. It was Eric, Martin's assistant. Eric looked nervous, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "James," he said quietly, "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but Martin's been trying to find a way to discredit you. He asked me to dig up anything I could, but there's nothing. You're clean." James wasn't entirely surprised, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill down his spine. "Thanks for telling me, Eric," he said, his voice steady but serious. "I appreciate it. Be careful, though. I don't want you getting caught in the crossfire." Eric nodded, his expression conflicted. "I just thought you should know. You don't deserve what he's trying to do." That night, James found it harder than usual to sleep. He replayed the events of the past week in his mind, thinking about everything that had led to this point. He thought about his parents, their struggles and sacrifices, and the lessons they had instilled in him. He thought about the anonymous messages of support, the colleagues who had quietly rallied behind him, and he thought about the upcoming HR meeting, wondering what it would bring. Friday arrived, and with it came a palpable sense of anticipation. The office felt like a powder keg, ready to explode at any moment. James spent the morning focusing on his work, but he couldn't ignore the undercurrent of tension. Mia stopped by his desk just before lunch, giving him a reassuring smile. "You've got this," she said simply. "We're all behind you." James nodded, grateful for her support. As the clock ticked closer to 3 p.m., he made his way to the HR office, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. Linda greeted him with the same professional demeanor as before, but this time there was a subtle warmth in her tone. "James, thank you for coming," she said, motioning for him to sit. "Before we begin, I want to assure you that this meeting is about finding a resolution that aligns with our company's values." James nodded, his expression calm but guarded. "I appreciate that," he said. As they began discussing the incident, James felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, he was relieved that the company seemed to be taking the matter seriously. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that Martin was still plotting something. The stakes felt higher than ever, and James knew the next steps would be critical. Back in the office, the team was buzzing with anticipation. Word had spread about the HR meeting, and everyone was waiting to see how it would play out. Mia and the others had finalized their collective statement, and they were preparing to present it to HR if necessary. It was a gamble, but they were willing to take it. As the meeting stretched on, tensions in the office reached a fever pitch. Martin paced in his office, his mind racing as he considered his options. He knew his position was precarious, but he wasn't ready to concede defeat. Not yet. And James, sitting across from Linda in the HR office, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Every word he spoke, every choice he made, felt like it carried the potential to shape not just his own future, but the future of the entire office. The climax was nearing, and everyone, whether they realized it or not, was holding their breath. The air in the HR office was thick with tension as Linda leaned back in her chair, carefully choosing her next words. James could tell she was trying to balance the weight of the situation with the company's interests. Before she could speak again, there was a knock at the door. Both turned toward it, and Linda called out, "Come in." To James' surprise, it was Mia. She stepped inside, clutching a folder, her expression resolute. Linda frowned slightly, clearly puzzled by the interruption. "Mia, this is a private meeting," she began, but Mia cut her off politely yet firmly. "I know, I'm sorry for barging in, but this is important. I think James deserves to have this." She handed the folder to Linda, who opened it and began flipping through the pages. James caught a glimpse of what looked like a typed document with several signatures at the bottom. "This is a statement," Mia explained, her voice steady. "It's from the team. We wanted to make it clear that what happened in that meeting wasn't an isolated incident. Martin's behavior has been a problem for years, and it's time for it to stop. We're all willing to stand by James." Linda's expression shifted as she read through the statement. She looked back at Mia, then at James, her face unreadable. "This is significant," she said finally. "But I need to review this further before making any decisions." Mia nodded. "We understand. We just wanted to make sure you have the full picture." As Mia left the room, James felt a surge of gratitude. He hadn't expected anyone to go that far on his behalf, and it reinforced his determination to see this through. But as the meeting continued, the stakes only seemed to grow. Linda outlined the company's investigation process, emphasizing that while they took the matter seriously, they also needed to ensure fairness for all parties involved. James listened carefully, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that Martin was still a step ahead, plotting his next move. And as the meeting wrapped up, his suspicions were confirmed. When James returned to his desk, he found an email waiting for him. It was from Martin, and the subject line read, "Urgent Performance Review Meeting." James opened it, his heart sinking as he read the message. Martin had scheduled a meeting for later that afternoon, citing concerns about recent destructions and requesting James' immediate attendance. It was a bold move, one that felt like a thinly veiled attempt at retaliation. James forwarded the email to Linda, adding a brief note explaining his concerns. To his relief, she responded quickly, assuring him that HR would be present at the meeting to ensure it remained professional. When the time came, James entered the conference room to find Martin already seated, his expression cold and calculating. Linda was there as well, along with another HR representative who introduced himself as Mark. The tension in the room was palpable as the meeting began. Martin wasted no time diving into his grievances. He rattled off a list of vague complaints, citing disruptive behavior and failure to maintain a collaborative work environment. James listened silently, his jaw tightening as Martin's accusations grew increasingly absurd. But then, something unexpected happened. As Martin was mid-sentence, the door to the conference room opened. It was Eric, holding a laptop. He looked nervous but determined. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, "but I think you all need to see this." Martin's face went pale as Eric set the laptop on the table and pressed play. A video began to play, showing a clip from a previous team meeting. In the video, Martin could be heard making a series of inflammatory comments, his tone dripping with condescension and disdain. The room fell silent as the recording played, the weight of Martin's words hanging heavy in the air. When the video ended, Linda turned to Martin, her expression sharp. "Care to explain this?" she asked. Martin stammered, his usual confidence evaporating. That's taken out of context," he said weakly. "It doesn't reflect the full conversation." Linda didn't look convinced. "We'll review the full recording," she said, her tone firm. "But this raises serious concerns about your conduct, Martin. I think it's best if you step away from any active managerial duties while we complete our investigation." Martin's face flushed red, but he didn't argue. He knew he was cornered, at least for the moment. As the meeting adjourned, James felt a mixture of relief and vindication. But he also knew this wasn't over. The fight for accountability was far from finished, and the stakes had only gotten higher. The days following the explosive meeting were filled with a tense silence across the office. Martin's absence was noticeable, his office door shut and locked, a stark reminder that the company was finally taking steps to address his behavior. Linda had assured James and the team that a thorough investigation was underway and that they would all be kept informed of its progress. For the first time in what felt like forever, James allowed himself a glimmer of hope that justice might prevail. But as much as the office seemed to settle, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. He had seen how people like Martin operated, always scheming, always looking for a way to turn the tables. And James was right to be wary. Late one afternoon, as he was wrapping up for the day, an email notification popped up on his screen. It was from an unknown sender, the subject line reading, "Urgent. Read before tomorrow's meeting." Curiosity and caution warred within him as he clicked it open. The email contained a single attachment, labeled confidential. James hesitated before opening it, but his instincts told him it could be important. The document inside was a series of internal emails, and as James read through them, his stomach turned. They were exchanges between Martin and a senior executive, outlining a plan to scapegoat James for the company's recent controversies. The emails painted James as divisive and implied that removing him would restore harmony. James sat back, his heart pounding. This was bigger than Martin. It was a coordinated effort to silence him and protect the status quo. But who had sent him this? And why now? He looked at the timestamp on the email. It had been sent just an hour ago from a burner account. Someone on the inside wanted him to know what he was up against. That night, James barely slept. He forwarded the emails to Linda, attaching a note explaining their significance and urging her to address them in the ongoing investigation. He wasn't sure if it would be enough, but he knew he couldn't stay silent. The next morning, the entire office was called into a company-wide meeting. The air was thick with unease as employees filed into the conference room, murmuring amongst themselves. At the front of the room stood Linda, flanked by Mark and another senior executive. Martin was conspicuously absent, but his shadow loomed over the proceedings. Linda began by addressing the investigation. "We've reviewed the evidence and conducted interviews with many of you. What we've uncovered is deeply concerning and unacceptable." She paused, scanning the room. As of today, Martin is no longer with the company. There was a collective intake of breath, followed by a smattering of relieved murmurs. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but he knew this wasn't the end. Linda wasn't finished. "We've also discovered additional evidence that suggests this issue goes beyond one individual. There have been systemic failures at multiple levels of leadership, and we are committed to addressing them." James watched as the senior executive beside Linda shifted uncomfortably. He recognized him from the emails. The man's expression was a mix of guilt and defiance, and James realized this was his moment. Before Linda could continue, James stood up. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I think there's something else everyone should know." He stepped forward, holding up his phone. "I received these emails last night. They show that certain individuals have been working behind the scenes to target me and undermine this investigation." The room fell silent as James forwarded the emails to Linda's screen. She read through them quickly, her expression darkening. The senior executive began to stammer. This is clearly a misunderstanding." Linda cut him off. "Enough. This is exactly the kind of behavior we're trying to root out. I'll be taking this to the board immediately." She turned to the employees. "And to all of you, I want to say this. If you've experienced or witnessed anything similar, please come forward. We're committed to creating a workplace where everyone feels safe and valued." As the meeting ended, James felt an overwhelming mix of emotions. Relief, yes, but also a lingering sense of disbelief. The fight had been harder than he'd ever imagined, but had also revealed the strength of those around him, the colleagues who had stood by him, the anonymous whistleblower who had risked everything to expose the truth. Later that day, as James packed up to leave, Mia approached him, a small smile on her face. "You did it," she said simply. James shook his head. "We did it. And it's not over yet." Mia nodded, her expression serious but hopeful. "No, it's not. But this feels like a start." As James walked out of the office that evening, he allowed himself a moment to reflect. The battle wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. And while the scars of the fight would remain, so too would the lessons and the allies he had gained along the way. What he didn't know yet was that this victory would inspire others far beyond the walls of his office, sparking a ripple effect of change that would reach places he could never have imagined.